The rain in Daegu that night fell the way regret does, quietly at first, then all at once, until a man couldn't tell anymore if his face was wet from the sky or from something older. Han Do-yoon stood under the awning of a flower shop across from a restaurant he used to know too well, watching a woman laugh with her hand resting on another man's arm. Yoo Min-ah. Even now, even after everything, the sound of her laugh still found the exact place in his chest where he kept the boy who used to believe her. His phone buzzed. A text from a name that had, until 3 months ago, meant nothing to him and now meant almost everything. Adjoa, are you still coming? I saved you the last piece of the peanut stew. Don't make me eat it out of spite. He smiled despite the rain, despite the woman across the street who hadn't seen him yet. He typed back, on my way. Save the spite for someone who deserves it. But even as he pocketed the phone, some old, tired part of him turned back toward the restaurant window one more time, the way a man checks a wound that has already scarred over, just to be sure it doesn't still hurt. It hurt. That was 3 months into knowing Adjoa. To understand how a grown man ends up standing in the rain measuring his own foolishness, you have to go back 3 years, to a version of Do-yoon who didn't yet know the difference between love and habit. Do-yoon met Yoo Min-ah at a university alumni mixer in Daegu, the kind of event his mother had pushed him to attend because, in her words, an architect who only talks to blueprints will marry a blueprint. He wasn't looking for anything. He had a modest firm job, a habit of working too late, and a general belief that most people were more interesting on paper than in person. Min-ah was not most people. She had a way of making a room feel like it existed for her benefit, and somehow she made you feel lucky to be furniture in it. She wore confidence like other people wore perfume, you noticed it before you noticed her face. When she turned that attention on Do-yoon, asked him about the buildings he wanted to design one day, listened with her chin propped on her hand like his answer actually mattered, he did not stand a chance. For the first few months, it was good. Or it looked good, which for a while is the same thing to a man who wants to believe. Then the small things started. She was late, always, and somehow he was the one who ended up apologizing to the restaurant staff for the wait. She would cancel plans for reasons that changed depending on who was asking. She introduced him to her friends as someone I'm seeing, never his name first, like he was a category rather than a person. When he designed a small pavilion for a competition and won second place, she said, "Only second? I thought you were better than that," in front of his own colleagues, and laughed like it was affectionate. He told himself she was playful. He told himself the day she called him useless for forgetting to bring an umbrella, in front of her cousin, at her cousin's own housewarming, she had just had a long day. He collected excuses for her the way other men collect stamps, quietly, patiently, and with a strange sense of pride in the collection itself. There was the incident with his mother's 60th birthday, which Min-ah had promised, weeks in advance, to attend. She cancelled that morning, citing a headache, and then posted photos 3 hours later of herself at a spa with friends, looking entirely headache-free. When he mentioned it, gently, she told him he was checking up on her like a jealous teenager, that a woman needed her own life, that if he couldn't understand the difference between resting and socializing then perhaps he was the one with the problem. His mother never said a word about it directly, but she started, from that day forward, referring to Min-ah only as your friend rather than by name, a small quiet verdict Do-yoon chose not to examine too closely at the time. There was the incident at his firm's year-end dinner, where a senior partner had asked Min-ah what she did for a living, and she had answered brightly, at length, about her work in luxury retail consulting, and then, almost as an afterthought, gestured at Do-yoon and said, "And this one draws buildings. Don't ask him to explain load-bearing anything, he'll talk your ear off," in a tone that got a polite laugh from the table and left Do-yoon quietly folding into himself for the rest of the evening, wondering when exactly his life's work had become something to be waved away as a party trick. There was the incident with the ring, not an engagement ring, but a bracelet he'd saved 3 months to buy her for their second anniversary, a delicate gold piece from a small jeweler in Seoul she'd once mentioned admiring in passing, months earlier, a comment he'd filed away and quietly acted on because that was the kind of listening he did, the kind of care he brought, even when it went entirely unreturned. She opened the box, looked at it for a long moment, and said, "Oh, I thought you meant the other one, the one with the sapphire. This is nice too, I guess," before setting it aside and returning to her phone. He wore that memory like a stone in his shoe for months, the specific humiliation of having been thoughtful, and watched it land like a disappointment. His best friend, Jae-won, was the only one who said it plainly one night over soju, 3 cups in, when honesty gets easier and stupider at the same time. "She treats you like a spare umbrella," Jae-won said. "Something you only remember exists when it's raining and you need it." "She's just direct," Do-yoon said. "She's not direct. She's cruel with good posture." "There's a difference." Do-yoon laughed it off. He always laughed it off. Because the alternative was admitting that somewhere in the last 2 years, he had gone from a man who designed buildings that would stand for 100 years to a man who rearranged his entire personality around not upsetting a woman who was rarely, if ever, kind to him. It went on like that for 2 years and 8 months. There were proposals of marriage he floated that she deflected with "let's not rush," while she attended 2 of her friends' weddings in that same window and cried happy tears at both. There were nights he drove 40 minutes at midnight because she said she felt sick, only to find her out with friends, and when he asked, she told him he was being paranoid, that he was suffocating her, that maybe the problem was he loved her too much and didn't trust her. He apologized for loving her too much. That was the kind of fool he had become. The end, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic. There was no scene, no slammed door. It came on an ordinary Tuesday when Min-ah forgot his birthday for the 2nd year running, and when he mentioned it, gently, so gently, like a man defusing something that might explode, she said, "God, Do-yoon, it's just a date. Why does everything have to be about you feeling neglected?" And something in him, some long-abused muscle, simply stopped flexing. Not out of anger. Out of exhaustion. He looked at her across the table and realized, with a strange calm, that he had spent almost 3 years trying to earn basic decency from someone who had decided long ago that basic decency was a reward, not a baseline. "I don't think I can do this anymore," he said. She laughed, the way people laugh when they've heard a joke they've heard before and know how it ends. "You say that every few months." "I know," he said. "This is the last time I'll say it and mean it." She didn't believe him. He wasn't sure he fully believed himself, not that night. But he moved out of the habit of texting her good morning. He deleted the couple photos slowly, one by one, like removing bandages carefully to avoid tearing the skin. He let Jae-won drag him to the gym, to hiking trips, to anywhere that wasn't the 4 corners of his apartment where her voice still echoed in his memory of certain furniture. It took 4 months before he stopped flinching every time his phone buzzed, half hoping and half dreading it was her. It took 6 months before he could say her name without his stomach tightening. It took almost a year before he understood that healing wasn't a straight road. It circled back on itself, ambushed him on ordinary Tuesdays with the smell of a perfume that reminded him of her, or a restaurant they used to go to. But slowly, the ambushes came further apart. Slowly, he became a man again instead of a man-shaped hole where a relationship used to be. He met Adjoa Boatemaa on the coldest day of that winter, in a way that felt, looking back, almost too ordinary to be the beginning of anything. His firm had been hired to consult on the interior redesign of a boutique hotel in downtown Daegu, one that wanted to incorporate international textile art into otherwise minimalist Korean architecture, a bridge between 2 worlds, the client had called it, using the kind of language clients use when they've read one article about global design trends. Do-yoon's job was to make sure the structural elements didn't fight with whatever textile installation the client had commissioned. The textile artist, it turned out, was a Ghanaian woman named Adjoa Boatemaa, originally from Kumasi in the Ashanti region, who had spent the last 4 years building a small but respected studio in Korea specializing in adapting Kent-inspired patterns into contemporary interior pieces, wall hangings, upholstery, room dividers that used traditional Ashanti weaving techniques reinterpreted for modern spaces. She arrived at the site meeting 11 minutes late, apologized exactly once, clearly, without groveling, and then got straight to work laying out fabric swatches against the wooden paneling samples with the brisk efficiency of someone who had learned early in life that apologies were currency to be spent sparingly and only when truly owed. "Your load-bearing wall," she said, not looking up from the swatches, "is going to fight my color palette if we don't adjust the lighting angle. Can it move 6 inches, or is that architecturally sacred?" Yoo-Min found himself almost smiling at the word sacred, used with just enough irony to tell him she respected the constraint without being intimidated by it. "It can't move," he said. "But I can adjust the lighting rig instead. Give me the palette and I'll build around it." She looked up then, properly, for the first time. Dark eyes that assessed rather than performed. "Most architects tell me to change my colors to suit their walls." "Most architects haven't seen your work," he said, gesturing at the swatches, deep golds threaded through indigo, geometric patterns that seemed to hold centuries of meaning in their repetition. "I'd be an idiot to make you dim this down for a wall I can just relight." Something in her face shifted, not quite a smile, but the loosening of a posture that had clearly been braced for an argument. "All right, architect. Let's see if you mean that in 3 weeks when I'm still asking for adjustments." He meant it in 3 weeks. He meant it in 6. Their working relationship became something neither of them announced but both of them noticed: the coffee she brought to site visits because she'd noticed he skipped breakfast, the way he started scheduling meetings around the hour when the natural light best matched what she needed to check her colors against, without her ever having to ask. They argued about installation angles the way people argue when they respect each other too much to just concede for the sake of peace, and somehow the project deadline came and went, and they were still finding reasons to have coffee. She told him about Kumasi in pieces, the way people share things that matter to them, not as one big story, but as fragments offered when the moment felt right. About her grandmother, who had been a master weaver and had taught Adjoa that a good pattern tells the truth about the person who made it, that you cannot weave dishonesty into Kent and have it come out looking right, because the structure itself demands integrity. About her name, Adjoa, given because she was born on a Monday, and Boatemaa, a name in her father's line that carried the weight of women in her family who had built things, businesses, homes, reputations, out of very little. "In my family," she told him once, over coffee that had gone cold because neither of them wanted to end the conversation to get more, "we don't believe in loving someone who makes you shrink. My grandmother used to say, if a man makes you small, he is not a husband, he is a thief. He is stealing you from yourself, one small moment at a time." Yoo-Min said nothing for a long moment, turning the cold coffee cup in his hands. "I used to date someone who did that," he finally admitted. "It took me years to notice I'd shrunk. I only noticed because someone else pointed at the empty space where I used to be and asked where I went." Adjoa didn't offer sympathy he hadn't asked for. She simply said, "Then don't apologize for taking up space now. Some men come out of that kind of thing and spend the rest of their lives afraid to need anything from anyone. Don't be one of those men." He thought about that sentence more than he wanted to admit. There was an afternoon, weeks before anything between them had a name, when Adjoa invited him to her studio for the first time, ostensibly to approve a final color adjustment before the installation shipped. He arrived to find her arguing, in rapid, good-natured Twi, with her assistant over the proper tension for a warp thread, switching effortlessly into English the moment she noticed him in the doorway, as though flipping a switch between 2 entirely complete versions of herself. "You're early," she said, not unkindly. "Sit. Watch. You might learn something about patience." He watched her work for the better part of 2 hours, saying almost nothing, fascinated by the particular quality of attention she brought to something as seemingly simple as thread, the way she'd pause, frown, unpick 6 rows of careful work without visible frustration because the tension had drifted a fraction too loose, the way she explained, when he finally asked, that a weaver who rushes past a mistake is only hiding it inside the cloth where it will show itself later, at the worst possible moment, when it's hardest to fix. "That sounds like more than a weaving lesson," he said. "Everything my grandmother taught me was more than a weaving lesson," she said. That was rather the point of her teaching it through cloth. Some truths go down easier disguised as craft. There was another evening, a month into whatever this was becoming, when she invited him to a small gathering of other West African expatriates living in Daegu and Seoul, a loose, warm community of nurses, engineers, business owners, and graduate students who had built, out of necessity and genuine affection, a version of home inside a country that did not always make room for them easily. He was, for most of the evening, the only Korean face in the room, and he understood, watching Adjoa move between conversations in English, Chui, and the halting, affectionate Korean she'd picked up over 4 years, that he was being quietly evaluated, not unkindly, but thoroughly, by people who loved her and had every right to wonder about the man occupying more and more of her time. An older man named Mr. Ose, who ran an import business and had known Adjoa since her first year in Korea, pulled Yoo-Min aside near the end of the night with the particular directness of a man who had earned the right to it. "She works twice as hard as anyone in that room to be taken seriously here," Mr. Ose said, nodding toward Adjoa, who was laughing at something across the room, entirely unaware of the conversation happening about her. "Twice as hard, and still, people assume things about her before she opens her mouth. If you're going to be in her life, you don't get to be one more person she has to manage carefully. You understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand," Yoo-Min said. "I don't want to be managed. I want to be someone she doesn't have to brace herself for." Mr. Ose studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, satisfied, in the same way Adjoa herself often was, assessing rather than performing. "Good answer. Let's see if you live it." Their first date, 3 weeks after the project officially ended, because neither of them wanted to blur professional lines while the contract was still active, a point of principle Adjoa insisted on and Yoo-Min respected more for the insisting, was at a small Ghanaian restaurant she knew in Seoul, a 2-hour train ride she made worth it by narrating the entire menu to him like a woman introducing him to family. "This is jollof," she said, sliding a plate toward him with the seriousness of a diplomat presenting terms of a treaty. "And before you ask, no, it is not the same as Nigerian jollof, and if you ever say that to a Ghanaian in public, I will not be responsible for what happens to you." "Noted," he said, laughing properly, a sound that surprised him with how easily it came. "Is there a similar rule about calling it fried rice?" "There is a rule about a great many things, Yoo-Min. You'll learn them as we go." "As we go." He noticed the phrase, the quiet assumption of a future folded into a sentence about rice, and something in him, something that had spent years being told he was too much, too needy, too eager, allowed itself, cautiously, to hope that this might be a person who wouldn't make him regret being eager. By the 3rd month, he had learned her rhythms. She woke at 5 to sketch before the day's obligations crowded her mind. She called her mother in Kumasi every Sunday without fail, and if you called during that hour you'd get no answer, no exceptions. She had a temper that showed itself rarely but fully when it did, usually in defense of someone she considered hers to protect, which now, to his quiet astonishment, included him. She did not do half measures. If she was going to be with him, she told him plainly one night, she was going to be with him completely, and she expected the same in return. "I'm not interested in being someone's backup plan," she said. "I've seen women accept that role and call it love because they didn't know love could look different. I know what it looks like. I grew up watching my mother refuse to shrink for anyone, including my father, who learned very quickly that Boatemaa women do not do backup plans." "I don't want a backup plan," Yoo-Min said. "I want this. I want you. I've spent enough years being someone's convenient option. I'm done being convenient for anyone." She studied him the way she studied fabric, checking the weave, looking for where the pattern might be lying to her. Apparently satisfied, she nodded once. "Good. Then we understand each other." They did understand each other, in the easy, uncomplicated way that made Yoo-Min realize, in comparison, how much of his relationship with Min-ah had been built on misunderstanding disguised as passion, the fights that felt like proof of feeling, the jealousy that felt like proof of love, when really it had all just been proof that neither of them had ever felt safe enough to be honest. With Adjoa, there was no performance. When he was tired, he said so, and she let him be tired without keeping score. When she was frustrated with a client, she said so, loudly, and he learned to sit with her frustration without needing to fix it, just to witness it. It was, he realized somewhere around month 4, the first relationship of his adult life that did not feel like a job he was constantly at risk of being fired from. Which is precisely why, when Min-ah found out, through the particular grapevine of mutual friends and the kind of social media algorithm that seems engineered specifically to torment exes, that Han Do-yoon, the fool who used to drive 40 minutes at midnight for her, the man who apologized for loving her too much, had not only moved on but seemed, by every visible measure, happy, something in Yoo Min-ah's carefully arranged world tilted in a way she did not appreciate. It started small. A comment on a photo. Do-yoon had posted a picture of Adjoa's finished installation at the boutique hotel, both of them standing in front of the gold and indigo wall hanging, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. Min-ah's comment, 3 days later, read simply, "Looks familiar. Glad you found someone to design a life around. Hope she knows what she's in for." Smiling face with smiling eyes. He almost didn't respond. Almost. But some habit, some reflex trained over 3 years, made him check who had liked the comment, made him notice that she had visited his profile 11 times in the past week according to the little indicator he hadn't known existed until Jaewon pointed it out, laughing. "She's not over it," Jaewon said, unhelpfully cheerful about it, the way friends are when they've been vindicated after years of saying "I told you so." Deleting the comment would just confirm you saw it. Ignore it. You're happy. That's the best revenge, Hyung. Do-yoon deleted it anyway, quietly, without comment, and thought that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. 3 weeks later, on a Friday evening when Do-yoon and Adjoa had reservations at a small rooftop restaurant to celebrate the 6-month anniversary of the hotel project's completion, the same project that had brought them together, a fact Adjoa found sentimentally amusing and had insisted they mark properly, Do-yoon's phone rang while they were being seated. Min-ah's name lit up the screen, a name he hadn't spoken to directly in nearly a year and a half. He almost let it ring out. He almost did the smart thing. But some old muscle memory, the one trained over years to treat her every contact as an emergency requiring his immediate attention, made his thumb hover over the green circle before he caught himself and pressed the red one instead, sliding the phone face down on the table. "Everything all right?" Adjoa asked, watching him with the particular attentiveness of a woman who notices things. "Fine," he said, and mostly meant it. "Old number calling by mistake, probably." He did not mention the name. He told himself it was because it didn't matter, that whatever Min-ah wanted, it had nothing to do with the life he was building now. He would spend the next several weeks discovering exactly how wrong that assumption was. Because 2 tables away from where they sat, in a corner booth Do-yoon hadn't noticed when they walked in, dressed like she had somewhere far more important to be and had chosen, entirely deliberately, to be here instead, Yoo Min-ah sat watching them, a glass of wine untouched in front of her, her expression unreadable to anyone who hadn't spent nearly 3 years learning to read every flicker of it. She was not there by accident. She had known, through the same grapevine that had told her about the photo, exactly which restaurant, exactly which table, exactly which night. And as she watched Han Do-yoon laugh, actually laugh, easily, at something the African woman had said, in a way he had rarely laughed with her even in their best months, Yoo Min-ah felt something cold and clarifying settle over her, the particular fury of a woman watching someone else enjoy, effortlessly, the devotion she had spent years training a man to give her and had never once valued until she watched it walk out the door. She had let him go because she never doubted he'd come crawling back the moment she crooked a finger. That had always been the arrangement, unspoken but reliable. She could be careless with him because his love was a constant, a given, something she never had to work to keep. Watching him now, lit up and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen in years, watching this woman with the confident hands and the steady gaze receive, without asking, everything Min-ah had never bothered to want until this exact moment, Yoo Min-ah understood, with the swift, total clarity of a woman recalculating a war she thought she'd already won, that she was not simply going to let this go. She lifted her wine glass, finally, and smiled at nothing in particular. What made it worse, though she would never have admitted this to anyone, not even to herself in the honest hours before sleep, was that she was not, at that moment, a free woman weighing an old flame out of simple nostalgia. She was engaged, quietly, not yet publicly announced, to Kwon Jae-hoon, the heir to a mid-sized construction conglomerate, a man whose family connections and steady, undemanding affection represented exactly the kind of secure future she had always assumed she was entitled to eventually collect. Jae-hoon was kind to her in the reliable, unbothered way of a man who had never had to fight for anything and therefore never thought to wonder whether he might lose it. He did not excite her the way watching a devoted man unravel for her had once excited her. But he was, by every practical measure, a good match, and she had told herself, in the months since accepting his proposal, that she was ready to become the kind of woman who settled into a comfortable, well-appointed life. Watching Do-yoon laugh, unguarded and lit up beside a woman who clearly required no management from him at all, Min-ah understood something about herself that she did not like. She did not actually want him back in the way a woman wants a man she loves. She wanted, more precisely, to know that she still could have him, that the door she had never valued enough to walk through herself remained hers to reopen whenever she pleased. It was not love. It had perhaps never been love, not really, not in the specific, patient, unglamorous way Do-yoon had clearly learned to give it since. It was the particular vanity of a woman who could not bear to watch a devotion she had taken entirely for granted finally, irreversibly, belong to someone else. The fool, she decided, was going to remember exactly who had made him. And so, quietly, without either Do-yoon or Adjoa noticing the shift in the air around their happy little anniversary dinner, Yoo Min-ah began, that very night, to plan, one eye on her wedding preparations with Jae-hoon, the other on a campaign she told herself was merely closure, though closure had never once required this much strategy. Yoo Min-ah did not attack the way an amateur would, loudly, obviously, in a way that would make her the villain of any story told afterward. She understood, better than most, that the most effective damage is the kind that looks like an accident, or worse, like concern. Her first move came 10 days after the rooftop dinner, in the form of a text that arrived at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, timed with the precision of a woman who knew exactly when a person's guard was lowest. I'm at Yeongnam Hospital. They think it might be my appendix. I don't have anyone else to call and I know this isn't fair to ask but I'm scared. Please. Do-yoon stared at the message for a long time in the dark of his apartment, Adjoa asleep beside him after a long day, her arm thrown loosely across his stomach in the particular way she slept when she trusted the person next to her completely. He knew, somewhere underneath the immediate spike of old, trained concern, that this was not his responsibility to carry. He knew there were parents, cousins, a small army of friends Min-ah had always kept close for exactly this kind of moment. He knew, and yet the muscle memory of 3 years spent believing her every emergency was his to solve did not simply switch off because he had spent 6 months with someone healthier. He did not go to the hospital. He wanted credit for that, later, when it mattered, though at the time it felt less like restraint and more like paralysis. He lay awake until 4 in the morning, phone in hand, composing and deleting replies, before finally sending, "I hope you feel better. I'm sure your family is on the way." She did not reply. Which, he would understand much later, had been the entire point. The silence that followed was not relief. It was reconnaissance. Now she knew he still felt the pull. Now she knew exactly how long it took him to cave, and exactly what kind of message would make him engage even when he tried not to. The appendix, as it turned out, was never mentioned again. There was no diagnosis, no surgery, no recovery period referenced in any future conversation. Do-yoon would not put the pieces together until much later, when the pattern had grown too large to ignore, that Min-ah had simply been testing a door, to see if it still opened when she knocked. The second move was subtler and reached Adjoa directly, though not from Min-ah's own name. An account with no profile picture and a username that meant nothing, Taegu_local_92, sent Adjoa a message on the professional page for her textile studio, the one she used to field client inquiries. Just thought someone should know, your boyfriend has been in contact with his ex again. Saw them together outside a cafe near his office last week, looked pretty cozy. Not my business but I'd want to know if I were you. Good luck with your work, love the Kent pieces BTW. Adjoa did not mention this to Yoo-min immediately. She was not a woman who ran to a man with every anonymous rumor a stranger dropped in her inbox. She had grown up watching her mother dismiss exactly this kind of thing as the noise jealous people make when they cannot stand someone else's peace. But she filed it away, quietly, the way a careful person files away a loose thread, not yet pulling on it but aware, now, of its existence. She did mention it, eventually, days later, in the offhand way people mention things they've decided not to be bothered by, testing to see if the person across from them flinches. Random question, she said, one evening while they cooked together, her hands moving through vegetables with the same precision she brought to her weaving. Have you talked to your ex recently? Do-yoon's hand stilled on the cutting board for half a second, not long, but long enough that a woman who studied patterns for a living noticed it. She texted me a few weeks ago, he admitted, because he had decided, in the 6 months since Adjoa had asked for complete honesty and given the same in return, that lying by omission was still lying. Said she was at the hospital. I didn't go. I told her I hoped she felt better and that was it. That was it? That was it, he said. Why do you ask? Adjoa considered him for a moment, weighing the coincidence of an anonymous message against the man standing in front of her offering the truth unprompted before she'd even had to press. No reason, she said finally. Someone sent me a strange message. Probably nothing. He should have asked what the message said. Later, he would understand this was the first small failure, not a betrayal, but a crack, the kind that widens only because it goes unexamined. At the time, relieved that she seemed unbothered, he let it go, and the conversation moved on to whether the peppers needed more salt. The third move was the one that required the most planning, and Yoo Min-ah, whatever else could be said about her, had never lacked patience when the prize mattered enough. She discovered, through the same social circles that had told her everything else, that Adjoa's studio was submitting a proposal to design the textile installations for a new luxury hotel chain expanding into Daegu, the kind of contract that could establish Adjoa's studio as a serious name in Korean interior design rather than a talented outsider doing niche work. Min-ah's cousin, as it happened, worked in an administrative capacity for the very hospitality group reviewing the bids. It took one lunch, one carefully constructed story about concerns from people in the industry about the reliability of a foreign studio taking on high-profile contracts, one implication, never a direct lie, Min-ah was too careful for that there had been issues on a previous project, personal conduct that had made a client uncomfortable, nothing specific, nothing that could be traced back to a name, just enough smoke that a risk-averse committee might quietly decide a safer, more established local firm was the wiser choice. Adjoa did not get the contract. She was told, politely, that the committee had gone in a different direction, the kind of phrase that explains nothing and closes every door behind it. She took the loss the way she took most professional setbacks, with a controlled fury that she processed alone before presenting anyone else with the composed version of herself. But something about this rejection nagged at her in a way ordinary business disappointment didn't. The feedback had been too vague, the reasoning too thin for a proposal her portfolio and references should have made airtight. She did not yet connect it to Min-ah. She had, at that point, no reason to. But she filed this away too, next to the anonymous message, next to the small hesitation over the cutting board, 3 threads that had not yet found each other but were quietly, patiently, weaving themselves into a pattern. She called her cousin Abina that night, the way she always did when something sat wrong in her chest and needed a second pair of hands to help her hold it properly. Abina had come to Korea 2 years after Adjoa, working now as a nurse in Busan, and had long since appointed herself the keeper of Adjoa's peace of mind, whether Adjoa asked for the appointment or not. They gave you nothing to work with, Abina said, once Adjoa had laid out the vague, unspecific feedback from the committee. That's not how a real concern sounds. A real concern has a name attached, a date, a specific complaint. This sounds like something somebody wanted to be true badly enough to make it sound true. I don't have proof of anything. I don't even have a shape for what I'm suspicious of. You don't need proof yet, Abina said. You need to stop assuming the universe is simply unfair to you today and start asking who benefits from you looking unreliable. That's grandmother's own rule, cousin. When the pattern doesn't make sense on its own terms, look for the hand doing the weaving. Adjoa did not sleep well that night, turning the unfairness of it over and over, not just the lost contract, sizable as that loss was, but the quieter, more corrosive fear underneath it, the fear. Every Ghanaian woman she knew who had built a life and a business in a country not her own carried close to the skin, that no matter how excellent her work, no matter how impeccable her professionalism, there would always be a version of events in which people found it easier to believe something vague and unflattering about her than to simply judge her by the work itself. She had spent 4 years proving, patiently, project by project, that she did not need anyone's charity, only their fair attention. The thought that someone might be actively working to undo that proof, brick by brick, without ever showing their face, frightened her more than she wanted to admit even to Abina. She did not mention any of this to Duyun that week. Not because she didn't trust him, but because some old, well-earned instinct told her to gather her own evidence quietly before she brought anyone else's theories into it, his least of all, given how recently his own history with Min-ah had resurfaced between them. There was another thread running quietly alongside the others, one Duyun would not learn about until much later. Min-ah had, in the weeks following the rooftop dinner, also begun visiting his mother. Not often, and never announced in advance to Duyun. She would time her visits for days she knew, through old habit. His mother frequented a particular market near the apartment she'd lived in for 20 years, and she would run into her there, warm and solicitous, asking after his mother's health, bringing small gifts of fruit or rice cakes, reminiscing gently about old times in a tone carefully calibrated to sound like nostalgic fondness rather than strategy. "I still think about your son so often," she told his mother, on the third such encounter. Over tea his mother had felt obligated to offer once Min-ah insisted on walking her home carrying her market bags. "I know things ended badly between us, and that was my fault. I've grown a lot since then, I understand that now. I just hope he's being careful. This new woman, I don't know her well, but I worry, it's such a big cultural difference, isn't it? I hope he's thought it through properly, for his own sake." Duyun's mother, who had spent 2 years quietly relieved her son was no longer with a woman she'd never much cared for, listened politely and said little, but the seed was planted regardless, the way seeds like that always are, not through argument, which invites resistance, but through a soft, repeated suggestion dressed as concern. Over the following weeks, small comments began surfacing in his mother's calls to him, phrased carefully enough that he couldn't quite trace their origin. "Is it difficult, the language and everything, with her family? Do her parents understand what marriage means here, or will there be complications? I only ask because I want things to be simple for you, that's all." He answered each question honestly and without defensiveness, not yet realizing the questions themselves had a source, and it would be weeks before J1, mentioning offhand that his own mother had seen Min-ah being sweet to your mom at the market, very touching, made the pieces click into place for Duyun with a cold, retroactive clarity. The next move, the one that finally forced Duyun's hand, arrived on a Saturday afternoon in the form of Min-ah herself, standing outside his apartment building when he came down to meet Adjoa for a weekend hike, dressed as though she had dressed for exactly this encounter and no other purpose. "Duyun," she said, and there was something rehearsed in the way his name broke slightly in her mouth, like a woman who had practiced sounding fragile. "I need 5 minutes. Please. It's important. Min-ah, this isn't a good time." "It's never a good time anymore, is it?" Her voice caught. "I'm pregnant, Duyun." The words landed the way a demolition lands, not loud at first, just a strange displacement of air before the structure actually falls. "That's not possible," he said, because it wasn't, because it had been 19 months since they had last been anything to each other, since before he had met Adjoa, since before any version of this timeline made sense. "It's complicated," she said quickly, too quickly, the kind of quickly that should have been its own warning. "I'm not saying, I don't know for certain whose. There was a night, a few months after we broke up, you were drunk, you came by, do you not remember?" "I don't remember because it didn't happen." He said it flatly, without heat, because some part of him, the part that had spent 6 months learning what honesty actually felt like from Adjoa, recognized immediately that this story had no floor beneath it, no specific night, no specific place, nothing but the shape of a claim designed to create doubt rather than deliver truth. Min-ah's face flickered, just slightly, the calculation of someone recalibrating a script that had just failed its first test. I could be wrong about the timing, she said, softer now, changing tactics. I've been so stressed, I'm not thinking clearly. I don't have anyone else, Do-yoon. I know I don't deserve to ask you for anything after how things ended. But I'm scared, and some part of me still thinks of you as the person I'd call in an emergency. He should have walked away in that moment. He very nearly did. But 3 years of training does not undo itself simply because a man has learned better in the months since, and some old, exhausted part of him, the part that still, despite everything, did not want to be the kind of man who abandoned a frightened woman, even one who had never once extended him the same consideration, found himself saying, "Go to a doctor. Get an actual answer before you say things like this to anyone. If it turns out to be true and it's mine, I'll take responsibility. But I'm not going to stand here and let you build a story on top of a maybe." "That's fair," she said, and something in her tone shifted just enough that, had he been watching more closely, he might have caught the flicker of satisfaction beneath the practiced fragility, because she had not, in fact, needed him to believe the pregnancy. She had needed only one thing, a witness. And she had one. Standing at the corner of the building, having arrived 4 minutes early for their hike and frozen at the sight of Do-yoon in close, quiet conversation with a woman she now recognized, with sick certainty, as the ex from the photograph, Adjoa Boatemaa watched the entire final exchange, watched Min-ah reach out and briefly touch Do-yoon's arm as she said something that made his face go tight with concern, watched him nod, watched Min-ah walk away with the particular grace of a woman who knows exactly how a scene will look to anyone observing only its surface. Adjoa did not storm over. She did not make a scene of her own. She simply turned, quietly, and walked back the way she'd come, texting him only once she was 3 blocks away, her hand steadier than she felt. Something came up. "Let's do the hike another time." The version of events Do-yoon gave her that evening was true, every word of it. He told her about the pregnancy claim, about the impossible timeline, about telling Min-ah to get proof before saying such things to anyone. He told her, too, about the appendix text he'd already disclosed, laying it all out with the particular thoroughness of a man who understood, correctly, that half of a true story told badly can do more damage than an outright lie. Adjoa listened without interrupting, her expression carefully unreadable in the way it became when she was working through something too large to react to immediately. "You told me about the hospital text," she said finally. "You didn't tell me she'd come to find you at your building." "I didn't know she was going to. It happened right before you arrived." "But you talked to her for several minutes. You let her touch your arm. You told her you'd take responsibility for a claim you say you know is impossible." "I told her that so she'd stop performing and go get an actual answer," he said, hearing, even as the words left him, how thin they sounded stacked against what she'd witnessed with her own eyes. "Adjoa, nothing happened. Nothing is happening. I promise you." "I believe that nothing physical happened," she said, and there was something in the careful precision of her wording that unsettled him more than an accusation would have. "I'm less sure that nothing is happening. A woman does not build an elaborate, impossible pregnancy story and then simply get proof as an answer unless the story was never about the pregnancy in the first place." He had no answer for that, because some part of him, watching it laid out in her calm, exacting logic, understood she was right, and had understood it perhaps from the moment Min-ah touched his arm, and he had felt, beneath his irritation, an old and unwelcome flicker of habit responding to her the way it always had. "I need you to end whatever channel still exists," Adjoa said. "Not manage it. Not respond kindly and hope it fades. End it. Block the number. Tell her plainly, once, that you will not be reachable for her emergencies anymore, real or invented. And then I need you to mean it in a way that doesn't require me to watch you decide, every single time, whether this is the emergency that finally breaks the rule." "I'll do it," he said. "I should have done it after the first message." She nodded slowly, not quite satisfied, not quite at peace. "I want to believe that's the end of it." The days that followed were quieter than either of them wanted to admit, a low simmer of unresolved tension neither one seemed to know how to address directly. Adjoa did not withdraw entirely, but she grew more careful, more measured, the easy affection between them replaced by a kind of watchfulness that Yoo felt like a change in air pressure before a storm. "I'm not trying to punish you," she told him, 3 nights later, when he finally asked why she seemed to be holding something back. "I'm trying to figure out if I'm dating a man who's already free of her, or a man who's still halfway tethered and just doesn't want to admit it because admitting it is uncomfortable. Those are very different men, Yoo, and I've spent enough of my life around the second kind to know I can't build anything permanent with him, no matter how much I might otherwise like him." "I want to be the first kind," he said. "I believe that you want to be," she said gently. "Wanting it and being it aren't the same thing yet. I'm not asking you to prove it in one conversation. I'm just telling you I'm watching, because I have to be, because the cost of not watching is something I've already paid once in a different form, watching my own mother explain away my father's inconsistencies for years before she finally stopped." He thought about that conversation more than he told her, turning it over during the quiet hours at his firm, during the drive home, during the moments right before sleep when old habits liked to resurface uninvited. He began, without her asking, to volunteer information he might once have quietly withheld, a message from a mutual friend mentioning Min-ah's engagement announcement, a moment at a work event where someone brought up her name in passing. Small things, none of them dramatic, but each one a deliberate choice to leave no door even slightly open, to let Adjoa see the whole shape of his life rather than only the parts he curated for her comfort. It was not, of course, the end of it. It was, if anything, only the beginning of the part of the campaign Min-ah had always considered the real work, because a woman who has spent years studying exactly how devoted a man could be does not simply fold because her earlier moves failed to land as cleanly as planned. If anything, watching Yoo draw a boundary, actually block her number 2 days later, actually send, through a mutual friend, a message stating plainly that he would not be contacted again, only confirmed for Min-ah what she had begun to suspect since the rooftop restaurant, that this African woman had taught him something Min-ah herself had never bothered to, and that the only way to win him back now was not through his guilt, which was clearly fortifying, but through his doubt about whether he'd ever truly known the woman standing beside him at all. The staged photograph took 3 weeks to arrange properly, and Min-ah executed it with the patience of someone who understood that rushed schemes leave fingerprints. She learned, through her cousin's continued proximity to industry gossip, that Adjoa would be attending a textile exhibition in Seoul without Yoo, who had a site inspection that same weekend he could not reschedule. She learned the name of the hotel where the exhibition's after-party would be held. And she arranged, through a friend of a friend who owed her a favor and did not ask too many questions, to have Yoo invited, under the guise of a professional networking opportunity, an architecture firm's informal mixer happening to overlap at the very same venue that same evening, an invitation extended by someone he had no reason to distrust. He went, because it was, on its face, an ordinary professional event with people he actually knew from his industry, with no visible connection to Min-ah at all. She was waiting in the hotel lobby when he arrived, positioned with the studied casualness of someone who had simply happened to be passing through, dressed for an event that did not exist, and the moment he stepped out of the elevator into the shared lobby space between the two functions, she moved toward him with practiced urgency, her hand catching his forearm. "Yoo, please, just 30 seconds. He pulled his arm back immediately, stepping away with visible irritation. "I told you not to contact me. I meant it. I'm not contacting you, I happen to be here, I just need you to know." It was at that exact moment, choreographed with a precision that would only become clear much later, that a photograph was taken, not by Min-ah herself, who understood the value of appearing to be the victim in her own frame, but by someone positioned near the entrance with a clear line of sight, Yoon's arm still partially extended from pulling away, Min-ah's hand at the edge of the frame still reaching, the angle and the crop and the exact millisecond selected afterward to erase all context. To make it appear, to anyone who had not been standing there, like a tender private moment between two people who knew each other far too well. The photograph reached Adjoa's phone 40 minutes later, sent from the same anonymous account that had contacted her weeks earlier, this time with no message at all, just the image, speaking, its sender clearly believed, for itself. Adjoa was still at the exhibition in Seoul when it arrived, standing beside her own installation, a piece she had spent 4 months weaving, gold thread through deep indigo, a pattern her grandmother had taught her meant I have come through fire and I am still whole. She looked at the photograph for a long time under the gallery's careful lighting, at the man she had let herself believe was different, his hand near another woman's face in a moment that looked, stripped of any context she hadn't been given, exactly like every story her own mother had once warned her never to accept as normal. She did not call him immediately. She did not scream, did not demand an explanation in the heat of the moment the way a less controlled woman might have. She finished the evening with the composure her grandmother's weaving had taught her a pattern requires, steady hands, even under fire, and it was only much later that night, back in her hotel room alone, staring at the ceiling with the photograph still open on her phone beside her, that she allowed herself to feel the full weight of it, not rage, not yet, but something colder and more final, the particular grief of a woman recognizing, with sick clarity, that she may have handed her trust to a man who was simply a more polite version of every warning she'd ever been given. She called Abina instead, at 2 a.m, her cousin's sleep-thick voice sharpening quickly once she heard the flatness in Adjoa's tone. "Send me the photo," Abina said. Adjoa did. There was a long silence on the line while her cousin studied it. "This is cropped," Abina said finally. "Look at the edge here, the light is cut off strangely, like something was removed from the frame. And his body is angled away from her, not toward her." "Cousin, I'm not saying nothing happened. I'm saying this picture is trying very hard to tell you a story, and pictures that try that hard usually have a reason to. I don't want to be the woman who explains away every red flag because she's scared of being alone again," Adjoa said. "I've watched too many of our sisters do that. I won't do it." "And I'm not telling you to explain it away," Abina said. "I'm telling you to get the whole story before you burn the house down over one photograph someone clearly wanted you to see. There's a difference between accepting bad treatment and refusing to be manipulated into ending something good by someone who isn't even in the room. Find out which one this is. You're too smart and you've built too much to let a stranger's anonymous account make your decisions for you." Adjoa sat with that for a long time after the call ended, the gallery lights long since dimmed, her installation standing quiet and gold in the dark beside her. She thought of her grandmother's hands, guiding hers over a loom decades ago, teaching her that a weaver who panics at the first snagged thread will cut the whole cloth rather than simply pause and work the knot free. She did not want to be a woman who cut the cloth. But she also refused to be a woman who ignored a snagged thread simply because pausing to examine it was frightening. When Duyun called her the next morning, cheerful, unaware, asking how the exhibition had gone, she did not mention the photograph at all. She wanted to see, first, whether he would. He did not because he was hiding anything, but simply because nothing had happened from his side worth mentioning, an ordinary professional mixer he'd already half forgotten by breakfast. The gap between his easy, uncomplicated recounting of the evening and the photograph sitting in her phone's camera roll told her everything she needed to know about how differently the same evening had unfolded for each of them, and how little he currently understood about what she was carrying. She simply said, in a voice so quiet and even that it frightened him more than shouting would have, "I think we need to talk when I get back. Properly. In person." And then, before he could ask why, before he could say anything at all, she ended the call. Adjoa did not show him the photograph until she was standing in front of him, 3 days later, in the small park near her studio where they'd had their first real argument about installation angles almost a year before. She held out her phone without a word, and Duyun looked at it for a long moment, his confusion visibly genuine, before something in his expression shifted from bewilderment to a slow, sick understanding. "This is from the mixer in Seoul," he said. "The one you knew about, the one my firm was hosting. You didn't mention Min-ah was there." "Because I didn't invite her. I didn't know she'd be there. She ambushed me in the lobby, I told her to leave me alone, I pulled away from her." "Adjoa, look at my arm, look at the angle, I'm pulling back, not reaching toward her." "I know what I'm looking at," Adjoa said, and her voice was steady in the way that frightened him more than anger would have. Because he recognized it now as the voice of a woman holding herself very carefully together. What I don't know is why, every single time, I'm the last person to learn what's actually happening. You didn't tell me she was at the mixer. You didn't tell me until I asked. There's a pattern here, Doo-yoon, and the pattern isn't infidelity. I don't actually think you slept with her, or kissed her, or did anything with your body that photograph seems to suggest. The pattern is that you keep managing her instead of ending her, and every time you manage instead of ending, I find out about it after the fact, from someone else, holding proof I didn't ask for. He wanted to argue, and some old reflex rose in him to defend himself point by point, but he made himself stop, made himself actually hear what she was saying instead of only hearing the accusation he was afraid of. You're right, he said finally. I keep treating her like an emergency I have to personally manage instead of a person I've already decided doesn't get access to me anymore. I told myself blocking her number was the end of it. It wasn't enough. She found other ways in, and instead of closing every door immediately, some old part of me kept leaving them cracked, just enough, because some habit in me still thinks walking away from someone who needs something makes me a bad person, even when that someone has never once needed anything from me except an audience. Adjoa studied him for a long moment, and something in her posture loosened, not fully, not yet, but enough that he understood he had said something true rather than something convenient. I need space, she said. Not forever. But I need to know this isn't something I'll be managing for the rest of my life, watching you flinch every time she finds a new door. I need you to actually close this, not for me, but because you've decided you're done being available to someone who has never been good to you. And I need proof, Doo-yoon. Not promises. I've had enough of promises from men who meant them in the moment. Give me 2 weeks, he said. I'll bring you proof. 2 weeks, she agreed, and left him standing in the park, watching her walk away with the same composed grace she carried into every room, and understanding, for the first time with real clarity, that he had exactly 2 weeks to become the kind of man who didn't need a deadline to do the right thing. He started with Jae-won, who, true to form, did not say I told you so, mostly because the situation had moved past the point where being right about Min-ah felt like a victory to either of them. The photo bothers me, Jae-won said, turning it over on his phone screen. Not the content. The framing. Someone took this from an angle that required standing at the entrance, waiting. That's not a candid shot. That's a setup. I thought the same thing. But I don't know how she'd have arranged for me to even be there. I got invited to that mixer through Sung-hyun, from the Yeonsu firm. That has nothing to do with her. Jae-won was quiet for a moment. Sung-hyun's fiancé works event coordination for a hospitality group. The same one that runs that hotel. It took 2 phone calls and 1 uncomfortable coffee to confirm what Doo-yoon had begun to suspect, that Sung-hyun's fiancé had, months earlier, done Min-ah a small, seemingly harmless favor, adding Doo-yoon's name to a mixer guest list at Min-ah's request, framed at the time as an old friend trying to reconnect professionally, nothing dramatic, a favor extended without any sense that it was one link in a longer, more deliberate chain. She didn't tell me why, the fiancé admitted, mortified, when Doo-yoon finally confronted her directly. She said you two had unfinished business to sort out as adults, that she just wanted a neutral place to talk. I didn't think, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize she'd use it like this. That was one thread. The next came from an unexpected place, Adjoa's own investigation, running in parallel to his, though neither of them had compared notes yet. She had gone back, quietly, to the luxury hotel contract her studio had lost months earlier, calling a contact on the review committee she'd built a cordial relationship with during the bidding process, someone who owed her enough professional goodwill to speak candidly off the record. There were concerns raised, the contact admitted carefully, about personal conduct. Nothing specific, nothing anyone would put their name to. It came through a staff member with family connections to the group's administrative office. I don't know the details, and honestly, looking back, none of us should have weighted something so vague as heavily as we did. The staff member, it turned out, was Min-ah's cousin. When Adjoa laid this out beside Doo-yoon's findings from Sung-hyun's fiancé, the shape of the whole campaign finally assembled itself in full: the hospital text designed to test whether the old habit still worked, the anonymous message to Adjoa's business page timed to plant doubt before it could be dismissed as coincidence, the sabotaged contract designed to make Adjoa feel unwelcome and insecure in the very industry she was trying to build a life in, the pregnancy claim designed purely to create a witnessed scene rather than any real belief that Yoo would return to her, and finally the staged photograph, the culmination of a plan that required patience, resources, and a complete disregard for the damage it did to a woman who had never once been Min-ah's actual rival, only her convenient target. There was one more piece neither of them had yet accounted for, and it was Yoon's mother, of all people, who finally supplied it, calling him one evening with an odd note of guilt in her voice. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Min-ah has been visiting me at the market a few times over the past couple of months. She said things, small things, about Adjoa, about whether things would really work, culturally. I didn't think much of it at the time. Mothers worry, and I told myself I was only asking the questions any mother would ask. But Jaewon's mother mentioned something last week that made me wonder if I'd been made to worry on purpose." Yoon sat with that for a long moment, feeling the last piece of the pattern click into place with a kind of grim, retroactive clarity, not just a campaign aimed at Adjoa, and not just one aimed at him, but one that had reached quietly into his own family, using his mother's love for him as one more thread to pull. "You weren't wrong to worry, Mom," he said carefully. "But the worry wasn't really yours. It was planted. I'll explain everything soon. I just need you to know none of it was true." His mother was quiet for a moment, and then, in a voice that carried more steel than he'd heard from her in years, said, "Then I owe that girl an apology I never should have needed to give. Bring her to dinner properly, Yoon. I want to meet the woman my son actually chose, not the version some jealous girl at the market wanted me to be afraid of." Armed now with the full shape of it, the guest list favor, the sabotaged contract, the campaign with his mother, the staged photograph, Yoon made one final decision before bringing everything to Adjoa: he would confront Min-ah directly, not to seek closure for himself, but because he understood, finally, that quietly walking away and hoping she'd lose interest had never once worked, and would not work now. He arranged to meet her at a public cafe, in daylight, with Jaewon waiting at a table across the room, close enough to serve as a witness if Min-ah tried to twist the conversation later into something it wasn't. "I know what you've been doing," he said, without preamble, once she'd sat down, her expression arranging itself instantly into practiced concern. "The mixer invitation through Sung Hyun's fiancé. Your cousin at the hospitality group killing Adjoa's contract. The visits to my mother at the market. The photograph. I know all of it, Min-ah. Every piece." For the first time since he'd known her, something in her composure genuinely faltered, not dramatically, but enough that he caught it, a small flicker of a woman realizing the floor beneath her performance had quietly given way. "I don't know what you think you know," she said, but the conviction had gone out of it. "I'm not here to argue about it," he said. "I'm here to tell you, one final time, in front of a witness, that it ends today. Not because I'm angry, though I am. Because I've finally understood something it took me far too long to see: you were never trying to get me back. You were trying to make sure I couldn't be happy without your permission. I'm not interested in being managed by you anymore, Min-ah. Not my guilt, not my mother, not my relationship. All of it, over. If I hear from you again, in any form, through any channel, I will make sure everyone who matters to your life right now, your fiancé included, understands exactly what you've spent the last several months doing while you were planning your wedding to him." He watched the threat land, watched her calculate, for just a moment, whether he was bluffing, and watched her decide, correctly, that he was not. "Fine," she said finally, all pretense of fragility gone now, replaced by something flatter and more honest than he'd seen from her in years. "Fine, Yoon. You've made your point." She left without another word, and Jaewon, joining him at the table once she'd gone, let out a low whistle. "I've never seen you talk to her like that. I've never had this much proof before," Yoon said. "It's a lot easier to stop being a fool once you can actually see the whole trick." He brought everything: the guest list confirmation, the committee contacts account, his mother's admission, the cropped photograph Abina had already flagged as doctored, to Adjoa on the last day of the 2 weeks she'd given him, laying it all out on her studio table with the same careful thoroughness she brought to reading a length of cloth for flaws. "She didn't do this because she loves you," Adjoa said quietly, when Duyun laid the full picture in front of her, evidence and all, exactly 2 weeks after she'd asked for it. "She did this because she can't stand that you're happy without her permission. That's not love. That's a woman who mistook your devotion for her due, and panicked the moment she realized someone else was collecting what she'd spent years refusing to value." "I know," Duyun said. "I should have seen the whole shape of it months ago. I kept treating each thing as an isolated incident instead of recognizing it as one long campaign. I'm sorry it took me this long. I'm sorry you had to build half this case yourself." Adjoa was quiet for a long moment, looking at him with an expression that finally, cautiously, held something warmer than the careful distance she'd maintained for 2 weeks. "I don't need you to be a man who never makes mistakes, Duyun. I need you to be a man who closes the loop when he finds one. You did that. Slower than I wanted, but you did it, and you brought me the truth instead of asking me to simply trust you blind. That's worth something. That's worth quite a lot, actually. So what happens now?" "Now," she said, and for the first time in 2 weeks, something like her old, easy warmth crept back into her voice, "You take me somewhere with better coffee than this park bench, and we stop talking about Yoo Min-ah entirely for the rest of the evening. I've given her enough of my time. She doesn't get any more of mine, and starting tonight, she gets none of yours either, not even in conversation." Min-ah, for her part, discovered the unraveling of her plan in the worst possible way, publicly, and with an audience she had never intended to have. Her fiancé, Kwon Jae-hoon, the heir to a mid-sized construction conglomerate whom she had been quietly courting throughout the entire campaign against Duyun, treating him as her real future while using Duyun's devotion as an emotional backup she couldn't quite bring herself to fully release, had grown increasingly uneasy over the preceding months at how frequently Min-ah's phone lit up with a name he didn't recognize, at how often she disappeared for old friend errands she wouldn't fully explain. When Sung Hyun's fiancé, racked with guilt after learning the full extent of what her small favor had enabled, confided the entire story to a mutual friend at a dinner party, a friend who happened to also be close with Jae-hoon's sister, the story reached Jae-hoon within days, arriving with all the ugly detail Min-ah had spent months carefully hiding: the staged photograph, the fabricated pregnancy claim used purely as theater, the sabotaged business contract engineered through her own cousin's position, months of a calculated campaign against a man she'd already discarded once, conducted while she was simultaneously planning her wedding to someone else. Jae-hoon did not confront her privately. He ended the engagement at his own family's dinner table, in front of both families gathered to finalize wedding arrangements, laying out precisely what he'd learned with the same clinical thoroughness Min-ah had once used to dismantle Duyun's confidence over years, except Jae-hoon did it in a single, devastating evening, in front of witnesses whose opinions Min-ah had spent her entire life curating. "I don't need a fiancé who spends her energy manufacturing chaos for a man she claims not to want anymore," he said, standing to leave before the first course had even been cleared. "I can only imagine what you'd manufacture for one you did." The story moved through their overlapping social circles with the particular speed reserved for scandal involving people who had always seemed to have everything arranged too perfectly. Her cousin was quietly let go from the hospitality group once the contract review interference came to light, an internal review triggered not by Duyun or Adjoa, who never pursued a formal complaint, but by the review committee itself, embarrassed to discover how easily their process had been compromised and eager to demonstrate accountability before it became a wider story. Min-ah's own reputation, built for years on the careful impression of a woman everyone wanted to be close to, curdled into something people discussed at gatherings she was no longer invited to, not with outrage, which might have afforded her a kind of tragic dignity, but with the far more corrosive currency of quiet, knowing amusement, the sound of people who had always suspected something and finally felt permitted to say it out loud. She did not send Duyun another message. There was, in the end, nothing left to send, and no one left to witness the sending. 6 months later, On a warm evening in early autumn, Doo-yoon stood in the small courtyard behind Adjoa's studio, where strings of light had been hung between the exposed beams and a length of golden indigo Kent cloth, the very pattern from the piece she'd been standing beside the night the photograph reached her phone, the one that meant "I have come through fire and I am still whole," hung along the back wall like a banner. He had spent the past 2 months learning things he hoped would matter to her more than any ring could on its own, enough conversational chui to greet her mother properly, the specific etiquette around how a family is formally approached in Ashanti tradition, the difference between gestures that showed respect and gestures that merely performed it. Her mother, Madame Afia, joined by video call from Kumasi, projected onto a small screen angled so she could see the courtyard, had spent the last 20 minutes laughing at his careful, slightly mangled pronunciation with the particular warmth of a woman who recognized effort when she saw it and had decided, somewhere in the second month of these calls, that this was a man worth welcoming properly. Adjoa's cousin Abina stood near the back, filming without being asked, because some instructions do not need to be given twice in a family that understands the value of remembering things properly. "Your grandmother taught you that a pattern tells the truth about the person who made it," Doo-yoon said, when Adjoa finally stepped into the courtyard, still in her work clothes, clearly expecting nothing more than dinner, stopping short at the sight of the lights, the cloth, her mother's face lit up on the screen. "I've spent the last year trying to be honest about who I actually am, not the man who spent 3 years managing someone else's chaos and calling it love, but the man who's learned, slowly, what it means to close a door completely instead of leaving it cracked. I don't want a life built on habit anymore, Adjoa. I want one built the way you build everything, with integrity all the way through, so that no matter which angle anyone looks at it from, it holds." She was quiet, one hand pressed briefly to her mouth, her eyes bright in the string-light glow. "I'm not asking you to shrink for me," he continued, lowering himself to one knee, the small box in his hand catching the light. "I'm asking if you'll let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to. Adjoa Boatemaa, will you marry me?" For a moment she said nothing at all, and from the screen behind them, Madame Afia's voice broke the silence first, laughing and crying at once. "Girl, answer the man before I fly there myself and answer for you." Adjoa laughed then, the sound cracking open into something unguarded, and crossed the last few steps toward him. "Yes," she said, pulling him up before he could finish the formality of waiting for her answer properly. "Yes, Doo-yoon. 1,000 times, yes." The cloth on the wall behind them caught the evening breeze and shifted slightly, gold thread through deep indigo, holding its pattern exactly as it was woven to, steady, unbroken, entirely itself, regardless of who had once tried to unravel it. They were married the following spring, in a ceremony that honored both families properly. The knocking ceremony came first, held in a rented hall in Kumasi that Adjoa's family had decorated with the particular unhurried care reserved for occasions meant to be remembered for decades. Doo-yoon arrived with his mother, his uncle standing in for the elder role tradition required, a modest procession of gifts arranged carefully behind them, bottles of schnapps, kola nuts, and, at Doo-yoon's own insistence over his uncle's mild objection that it wasn't strictly necessary, a length of handwoven cloth he had commissioned from a weaver in Kumasi as a gesture toward Adjoa's grandmother's memory, a small act of respect that made Madame Afia press a hand to her chest when she saw it. The formal exchanges took nearly 2 hours, translated back and forth between Chui and Korean by a cousin fluent in both, questions asked and answered with the ceremonial gravity the occasion demanded, who was knocking, on whose door, and for what purpose, each answer building the case for why this particular man deserved to be welcomed into this particular family. Doo-yoon's uncle, initially stiff and unfamiliar with the rhythm of it, found his footing by the second hour, delivering his final statement of intent with a warmth that surprised even Doo-yoon. "My nephew has been many things in his life," his uncle said, through the cousin's careful translation, "but he has never before been as certain of anything as he is of this. We do not come to take your daughter from you. We come to ask if we may be trusted to help her build the life she has already spent years building for herself, alongside a man who has finally learned what it costs to deserve that trust." Madame Afia, for her part, did not make it easy on him, teasing him gently through 2 rounds of questions about whether he truly understood what he was asking for, whether a man who had once let a woman treat him carelessly for 3 years had actually learned the lesson or merely learned to perform having learned it, questions that drew nervous laughter from the hall until Yoo answered, simply and without flourish, that the difference between performing a lesson and living it was exactly what the last year had cost him to learn, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life proving which one it had been. By the end of the ceremony, Yoon's mother, initially bewildered by customs she'd never encountered before, was crying openly, gripping Madame Afia's hand as the older woman told her, in careful English learned specifically for the occasion, that they were not gaining a daughter-in-law and losing a son, but that both families were gaining more of themselves. The Korean ceremony followed 2 weeks later, back in Daegu, more familiar in its structure to Yoon's side of the family but no less carefully attended to on Adjoa's. She had spent months learning the etiquette of it the way she once taught herself new weaving techniques, methodically, respectfully, refusing to simply be led through motions she didn't understand. Somewhere in the reception hall, threaded discreetly among the traditional Korean decorations at Adjoa's quiet insistence, hung small pieces of Kent cloth in gold and indigo, a pattern that had come through fire and remained, entirely and permanently, whole. Jaewon, getting the best man's toast, raised his glass and said simply, "I spent years watching my friend apologize for loving someone too much. I'm glad I finally get to watch him love someone who never once made him feel that loving fully was something to apologize for." Somewhere across the city, in an apartment she now occupied alone, having lost the fiancé, the reputation, and the easy admiration she had spent a lifetime curating, Yoo Min-ah scrolled past a photograph she hadn't meant to see, a wedding announcement shared by a mutual friend. Yoon's face lit up with a happiness she recognized, with a sharp and unwelcome pang, as something she had never once managed to put there herself, not in 3 years of trying, because she had never once understood that it could not be extracted through fear or guilt or careful manufactured need. It could only be built, patiently, by 2 people who had decided, each day, to actually show up for each other. She set the phone down without finishing the scroll, and for the first time in a long while, sat with a silence that offered her no one to blame but the version of herself that had spent so long mistaking control for love that she had never learned to recognize the real thing, even when, for 3 long years, it had been standing right in front of her, patient and devoted and entirely hers to keep, if only she had ever once thought to